National Federation of the Blind. Live the life you want.
The National Federation of the Blind advances the lives of its members and all blind people in the United States. We know that blindness is not the characteristic that defines you or your future. Every day we raise the expectations of blind people because low expectations create obstacles between blind people and our dreams. Our collective power, determination, and diversity achieve the aspirations of all blind people.
Accessible technology. Anything's possible and everything's accessible. Accessible technology.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kennedy Zimnick. I'm an Access Tech Specialist here at the National Federation of the Blind. This is part 2 of our 7-910 equivalent access requirements for students with disabilities presentation. This presentation is all about how to read a VPAT. But before we get into that, let's continue with our introductions. This has been a great collaboration between the National Federation of the Blind, Maryland State Department of Education, and the Maryland Department of Disabilities. Carl, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Carl Boeninger. I'm a non-visual accessibility analyst here at the National Federation of the Blind. Happy to have you all today and look forward to a good presentation.
Great, thanks. Stephen?
Hello, everyone. I am Stephen Polacek, the Director of the IT Accessibility Initiative at the Maryland Department of Disabilities. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Brandon?
Helps to unmute. So good afternoon. I'm Brandon Rosette. I am the Web and Content Accessibility Manager here at Maryland State Department of Education. I want to just thank both our collaborators here, Kennedy and Carl with Maryland Department of Disability, or with NFB, and Stephen with MDOD. This has been a truly valuable experience for our LEAs, and we look forward to expanding in future need. Thank you, everybody. Today, we're going to look at how to read a voluntary product accessibility template, or a VPAT. This collaboration between the National Federation of the Blind, Maryland State Department of Education, and Maryland Department of Disabilities is a direct result of legislation that was passed in 2022, section or statute 7-910, which is equivalent access for students with disabilities. This statute, or this law, required LEAs and Maryland State Department of Education to develop and procure accessible digital content. One of the aspects within that law was Section 2I, which required, starting last September, all invitations for bids, requests for proposals for digital tools issued by the state board or local school systems, to require a vendor to submit an accessibility conformance report, an ACR, that includes a voluntary product accessibility template, or VPAT. The accessibility conformance report, ACR, should explain how the ICT, or information and communication technology products, including software, electronic content, and support documentation, meets the most recent Section 508 standards under the Federal Rehabilitation Act of 1973. This is also required with this is conformance to COMAR 13A 0605, which required digital tools to meet Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.1 level AA. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So the common question we receive is, what's the difference between a VPAT and an ACR? So as I stated before, the VPAT is the voluntary product accessibility template. Yes, terrible name. It's really not voluntary on the federal level anymore, and it's not voluntary for MSDE or LEA procurements, but it is created by the ITI, and that is the name that they gave the template. The document, the VPAT, the document, is used to actually create the ACR, or Accessibility Conformance Report. The VPAT is a list of the standards with instructions on how to complete the actual template. The ACR is the completed VPAT, addressing how the product meets the criteria established by the requester. So when we look at this, these two terms, VPAT and ACR, are actually used interchangeably in the industry. So a lot of times, if you approach a vendor and say, I need an ACR, they might refer or respond with, I have a VPAT. Really, they are almost the same thing. Just one is the completed version with additional information, how it was conducted. One is actually the template. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So what is the purpose of the VPAT? Well, the VPAT really is a procurement tool. It helps, in this case, federal agencies, or in our case, Maryland State Department of Education and local boards of education, determine the current level of accessibility for that digital tool that they are looking to procure. It could be used as a self-assessment. Some vendors will conduct a VPAT or complete a VPAT to determine the current level of accessibility of their product. When we think about the benefits of a VPAT, it is a consistent format which does allow for an easier comparison when looking at products. And it also addresses those accessibility levels of support across the spectrum. So it will look at all standards. It breaks them down. So you may only be looking at WCAG level A in table 1, and you'll be able to see how it evaluates against level A standards. Table 2 will show you level or double A. So it will allow you to look at that level of accessibility conformance. Go ahead to the next slide. One of the other challenges or questions that I always receive when working with LEAs, and one of the hardest things to determine, is which version of the VPAT to use. So the VPAT is continually updated to stay relevant to the most current accessibility standards. So the most recent version of the VPAT is VPAT 2.5, which includes EN 301549 version 3, along with, and it's not here on the slide, I apologize, WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.2. There are 4 editions, and again, I will make sure the slides get updated before they're sent out. There's the WCAG 2.2 version. There's the Section 508, which includes WCAG 2.0 level AA. There is the EN version, and then there's what they refer to as the INT, or the International, which includes the previous 3 editions. And I keep saying versions, but they're editions. We have a version of the VPAT, so we're on version 2.5, and then there's additions within those versions. So when we look at this, we discussed in module 1 what was required under 7-910. 7-910 actually mentions a couple of different standards. It mentions Section 508. It mentions any other widely accepted and freely available technical standard. And then it also mentions as incorporated by COMAR 13A0605, which is WCAG 2.1 level AA. So when we look at, go ahead to the next slide. So what version should we ask for? Ideally, we would be asking for the most recent version. So in this case, we would be asking for VPAT 2.5. The challenge with asking for VPAT 2.5 is a vendor may or may not have updated to that version. So if we look back, the previous version is 2.4 revised. So if we're thinking of aligning to statute 7-910, if the standards are only requiring WCAG 2.1 level AA, section 508, then 2.4 revised would also meet that standards. So we want to ask for the most up-to-date version but we can always look at the resources provided by the ITI, who are the makers or the developers of this template, to determine which standards are aligned to which version of the template that you will need for your procurement.
Now let's look at the parts of the VPAT. Why are you reading this in the first place? First thing we'll talk about is the technical criteria. So the guidelines that make up WCAG Section 508 and European Union 301549. Those technical criteria are the testable standards that each of those laws or guidelines has. The report has 2 columns for each of those. The first is the conformance level. So how well do they meet the guideline? And then the second one is remark and explanations that it explains why they meet something, why they don't, what they're going to do, all of that. Those are the 2 columns that have to be filled out on the VPAT. Next slide, please. Conformance level, the first part, we're going to talk about both parts here. Conformance level is is listed in the term section of the VPAT report. So it has the definitions in there. You can go read it. The vendor can read it. Anyone who, if they post publicly, anyone can read it. So you should always know what these mean. But there's 5 conformance levels that are usable here. First is supports. So the functionality of the product has at least one method that meets the criterion without known defects or meets with equivalent facilitation. So effectively, it means we meet the standard across the board. Almost 99% of our product is in compliance with this standard. Second one is partially supports. So some functionality of the product does not meet the criterion. Usually this is referring to things where like your navigation menu is working on multiple parts of your page, but when you're actually like filling out maybe a quiz or something, the navigation menu goes away, or it's still there, but it's not working right in this one place. That's usually partially supports. Or things like there's 1 or 2 buttons on this part of the website that are not labeled, but the buttons throughout the rest of the site are labeled. So there's usually only a few problems within the whole product. Third is does not support. So the majority of product functionality does not meet the criterion. So effectively anything that can be found multiple times and across like a large portion of the site or the product, that means it's not supported. They're not meeting the criteria. Then there's not applicable. So the criterion is not relevant to the product. Usually you see these with video and audio media. If the product doesn't contain any of that, they might mark those as not applicable because the product is not supposed to host that kind of content, or they use like a third party like YouTube in order to host that content. So they might try to mark that as not applicable. And then finally, not evaluated. So the product has not been evaluated against this criterion. This can only be used in WCAG level AAA. Sometimes you'll see vendors try to use that elsewhere, but ultimately this is just saying we're not going to evaluate to this level. Occasionally you might see vendors evaluate to this level, either per their own choice, which is excellent, or they have hired a third-party vendor to fill out the VPAT for them, and that third party might choose to evaluate against those criteria. If they don't, remember that the law is requiring single A and double A guidelines, so anything on the AAA is, if they meet it, excellent, but there is a little bit more wiggle room there. Next slide, please. Now, the remarks and explanations section is where the vendor is going to give any additional information, or the person who completed the VPAT and did the testing is going to explain what issues there were. So what you're looking for here, or what it should be included, is information regarding the testing of a given criteria. What did they find? What issues were encountered, where they were located, if there were multiple instances of it, any kind of specifics that can tell us potentially tell us the impact this will have on our users. Second is information on application dependencies to support accessibility. So does it need a particular OS? Does it need to run on Microsoft, or does it need to run on Windows, or on Mac OS? App frameworks, does it have to be a mobile app? What is it based on? Is it Android or iOS? browser is recommended. If they think their product works better in Chrome than it does in Firefox or Edge or Safari, well, potentially that could be an issue and we need to be aware of it. Third, how the customer can find more information about accessibility issues. One method can be to include the bug ID, where customers can call the company's customer support to get additional information. So usually, if they don't give specifics in the listing there, you want some point of contact to reach out to figure out, is this a big issue, or is it something that only like a very, very small number of use cases are going to find it, or is it something that all of our students are going to be using and it's going to block everyone from using it? And then finally, any known workarounds for accessibility issues. So if they are doing anything to mitigate the problem, if they are having trouble with like a third-party plugin they purchased to put into their product, what have they done to make an accessible alternative? And then any plans they might have for future remediation that's going to come out either before the product is launched or is bought and launched, or will be part of just a regular update cycle, or if they're going to address it in any meaningful form in the future. Next slide, please. So reading the success criteria tables, keep in mind again that each success criteria contains the conformance level and the remarks and explanations. If you're missing one or the other, there's a big problem. The criteria itself, you need to know what criteria are most relevant to your needs. If there are any defects, determine and try to determine if they will impact your users. And then quickly disqualify vendors that do not meet relevant minimal levels of accessibility. So keep in mind who you're purchasing this for. If you know you have students right now who are blind or low vision or deaf of hard of hearing, you need to make sure that what you're buying meets their needs immediately, because you're going to put it into their hands soon. If you don't have any students with that particular disability, you might have a little bit of leeway for the immediate future, but it is something that will need to be addressed sooner rather than later. But you need to make sure that you're getting what you need immediately, and it's going to work out of the box. Next slide, please. A couple of things to look at before you start reading through the criteria, because the criteria are really dense. And there are some major details that might indicate this VPAT is not worth your time. First is the name of product and its version. So this section or this line should include the name of the product and the version. This information should match the submitted proposal. VPAT really doesn't help you if it's for a different product. Why they submit it then? And it doesn't help if it's for an older version of the product. If you're buying, version 2.8 and the VPAT is for 2.3, there's been enough updates that the VPAT might not be relevant anymore. That sometimes happens with annual reports that these companies will fill out for the VPAT, and they might say, oh, we've removed that section. Well, did you put something in its place, or what did you do to fulfill that same functionality, or did you just remove it entirely? How does that change the user workflow? Those are the kind of things that are a concern here, and we need to make sure that the VPAT we're looking at is relevant to what we want to buy. Second thing is the report date. At a minimum, the month and year should be reported. So March 2024, July 2023, that kind of thing. The report should be within 6 months for software as a service, also known as SaaS, and native apps as well. And anything else should be within a year. A report date should be cross-referenced to the version. Sometimes you can, it's going to be close enough that you can still work with it. It'll still be relevant, like a small minor update, like 2.1 to 2.3. That's probably mostly bug fixes or smaller issues that might have been addressed. But a larger scale jump like 2.1 to 2.8, or even a major version update from 2.1 to 3.0, something like that is going to invalidate the report you have. A report date is a good indicator of that too, because the more recent it is, the more relevant it's going to be to the product. because there's always things changing with these things, even if you don't see it in the version number. So anything that's older, take it with a grain of salt, or ask questions. Product description, just make sure again that it matches the submitted proposal. It should be the same description of the product they put in their bid. And again, that's just another way to make sure that this report matches what you want to buy. Contact information, email address is usually sufficient, but you want someone to talk to who is the person who filled out this report, so that you can know what they were thinking, how they tested, or if you have any questions about what they put in the report. Contact can be a third-party consultant if the vendor hired someone like Level Access or DQ in order to test their product for them and fill out the report. In this case, their contact information will likely be here. Notes is any additional information or details about the product or report, including third-party products included in the digital tool. So if they have included any plugins or widgets from somewhere else, or if there's other information that's needed, like login info or some other kind of form of access, that can be put here. Evaluation methods used. This is really important. They should describe the evaluation methods they use to test the product. That includes the tools that they used, if they used a screen reader, if they used something like Wave or Andy, or if they used, SortSite or SiteImprove, operating systems. Did they, what did they test it on? Did they test it on just Windows, or did they test it on Mac OS as well? Browser combinations. Did they include Chrome, Firefox, Edge, and Safari, the four most common browsers, or did they only do one browser, that kind of thing? And any assistive technology they used, like screen readers, like JAWS, or did they use NVDA, or they just use VoiceOver on Mac OS, or Narrator on Windows. And then finally, the applicable standards and guidelines. Usually this is, checking a box just to make sure they said, yes, we tested against the standards used here. It really should just align with the required equivalent access standards. So Section 508, WCAG 2.1, level AA, or higher standards, if they so choose, 2.2. Next slide, please. So when you're actually starting to read the VPAT, here's some red flags that you should look for. These are things that should click in your head, there's a problem here, and I should reach out to Brandon or another subject matter expert, or maybe to the vendor themselves and say, hey, what are you doing about this? First is when not applicable is repeated many times in a row, especially for level A criteria. When I talked about not applicable, I used the example of video and audio content because their product doesn't generate it or doesn't have it as a native feature. But sometimes they'll put not applicable for sections they think aren't applicable, or that they are saying, oh, the user wouldn't have this. But they also need to think about not just the user, but then the person generating the content, the people at both ends for most of these learning management systems. Or they might not understand what that criteria is, especially if there's someone who's not as familiar with accessibility. So they think, oh, I put this for a previous guideline, like info and relationships, but then they'll mark not applicable for focus order because they think, oh, it's in a reading order and everything's in a meaningful sequence. Focus order is different. There's some overlap there. So keep in mind, if they're marking entire sections as not applicable, there's probably a problem. When the remarks and explanation section does not provide sufficient information. So if they don't fill it out at all, that's a big issue, especially if they mark, does not support or partially supports. Or if they just say, we found issues here. They don't list the issues, or they don't tell you how often it was happening. Those kinds of things are red flags because we don't have enough information to make an accurate judgment of, is this accessible enough for our needs? An example on the next slide, the writer just copied language from WCAG, which is not sufficient explanation as to why the criteria is not applicable. If they're just quoting the guidelines, that doesn't actually tell us what the problem is, so we don't know its impact on our users. So we need to make sure that that section is giving us enough information to make a decision off of. And of course, if does not support is used throughout, then the project is not meeting accessibility standards. If they say we don't support, several of the guidelines, especially the level A guidelines, which are the most critical, well, then, we have a judgment call there. Or if they say does not support, and they don't give any indication that they're going to try and fix this before you get too far, and then we have no idea of their attitude towards accessibility. Are they going to be someone that's going to be difficult when we have to go back to them for fixes or updates? And then again, in line with what we mentioned earlier, partially supported with no explanation. If they just say partially supported, but they don't say what the problem is or what they're going to do about it, we can't make a judgment call, and we have to consider it as something that is inaccessible.
Okay, so here is an example of a poorly written VPAT, and we'll get into some more detail of why it's poorly written, and I'll clearly write it out in the slides. But I just wanted to show you first and see if you guys notice any red flags about this. So this is what a VPAT looks like. So we have criteria, conformance level, then remarks and explanations, as we've already talked about. So the criteria are those WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guideline criteria on the left side, and you'll see that they have their level A there. So that means it's the most basic level of accessibility. Then we have conformance level. This is where we have, either supports, does not support, not applicable, and then remarks and explanations, why these things are the way they are, explaining the conformance level. So if you notice here in this poorly written VPAT, the conformance level is not applicable for all this criteria that we see. And especially for 1.1.1, that means that's the very first piece of criteria in WCAG, non-text content. That's level A. If it's saying not applicable for level A, this very first criteria, then we have a big issue. And the rest of the examples I have here, this is just a small piece of a VPAT. A VPAT is a long document with a lot of different criteria. We'll show you examples, and when we send out this PowerPoint, there are links to examples that you can see, well-written VPATs. This is just a small screenshot, but we see it's not applicable in all of these level A criteria, so that's a big issue. And then in the remarks and explanations, they're just copying and pasting WCAG criteria. So non-text content that is presented to the user does not have a text alternative. They're just copying and pasting, and then they're just saying are not or does not. That's not sufficient explanation. If there really isn't sufficient explanation for a lot of these not having level A, but captions pre-recorded, I could see, and audio only and video only. If there are no video and if there is no audio, then not applicable. That is good here. But in the remarks and explanations, we don't see that. We don't see there is no pre-recorded content. We just see captions are not provided for pre-recorded content. That's not an explanation. That's not a reason as to why the conformance level is the way it is. So just wanted to point this out. And this is the same, for everything else on this slide. So let's keep going a little bit more detail. So where are these criteria coming from? These criteria are coming from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. That's whenever you hear us say WCAG, that's what we're referring to. So WCAG lays out clear instructions on how to create web content that can be used by people with access needs. So people who use screen readers and keyboard only. For example, that's just working at the National Federation of the Blind. I deal with a lot of visual disabilities. So people using screen reader and keyboard. But this also deals with deaf or hard of hearing, motor disabilities, every other sort of disability. Everybody uses technologies and computer and the internet, so it needs to be accessible to everybody. So WCAG includes code examples and language that can be interpreted easily, so they're easy to read. I recommend you look up WCAG yourself and read through their criteria. They, they are a little technical, obviously, but they really are easy to read, and they make it, they make the language easy enough to understand. These standards are created by accessibility experts from around the world. It's created by W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. They're the creators of HTML, HTTPS, HTTPS :// www. So they, they're the ones that they know a lot about the internet, and they are the ones that created these standards. Even if the software, this is important, even if the software has nothing to do with web content or the internet, even if it's not internet connected, these criteria are still used. Many of the same digital accessibility standards apply across all types of software. So it doesn't have, just because it has web content in the title, doesn't mean that it has to be internet connected. It's any software. Okay, so explaining WCAG single, AA, and AAA levels. So the WCAG guidelines are organized into 3 levels, starting at single A, most basic accessibility guidelines, to AAA, highest level of accessibility features. So single A, it's just written out as as a capital A, most basic accessibility criteria. Some examples are alternative text for images. So those are short description of images. If the context makes sense, then those images do need alt text, and captions for pre-recorded video. Also things like headings, properly labeled buttons, things like that, very basic things. AA, this is the standard that we are looking for, that LEAs should be looking for their software to be conform to, as AA standards. AA is written as 2 uppercase A's, determines the level of accessibility of a piece of software. Examples, contrast and headings. AAA, the highest level of accessibility possible, not required at the state or federal level. Examples, customizable foreground and background colors, customizable text contrast. So AAA really goes above and beyond in accessibility. Much of the AAA will be not applicable to a lot of the things. AAA gets into more of the specific, more specific features for specific disabilities, things like customizable text contrast, customizable text really comes to mind, colors, things like that. AA is the standard that we're most interested in, and if it is accessible to AA standards, then it is accessible. Okay, how these levels apply to a VPAT. Next to each criteria, there will be the level of conformance indicated, single A, AA, or AAA. If many level A criteria are being marked does not support, then many of the basic accessibility features are not supported, and that's an issue. Level A really is basic accessibility. So, nothing's 100%, but single A is very important. And if there's a lot of does not support, that could be a red flag to look for. Level AA criteria are a good indication if software is accessible. If AA criteria are marked as support or partially support, with sufficient explanation, of course, if it's partially supported, or even if it is supported, we do want, some sort of explanation. That is a good sign. Level AA conformance is the current standard for having accessible digital content. Level AAA standards are not included in federal or state law. They're the highest level of accessibility conformance. So again, it's important, they are a kind of the highest level of accessibility you can have. If it is in there, great. If not, that's okay. AA is the important level that we're going for. Okay, looking again at this core example, this is the same example that we had before. Level A criteria all being marked not applicable. It is rare for many of the level A criteria to not be applicable, especially with no explanation. The remarks and explanations are copy and pasted from WCAG. This section should provide real reasons either why the criteria does not apply to the software, parentheses audio criteria when there is no audio content, or why it isn't supported in plain language anybody would be able to understand. So again, I don't want to go through the screenshot again. It's the same screenshot we had before. If a lot of these level A criteria are not applicable, and it's marked as not applicable, most of the time that's just not true for a lot of this digital content. Things like I said, if there aren't videos and if there isn't audio, then okay, then it's not applicable to not have captions. But a lot of other things have to do with being able to navigate, being able to interact with buttons and labels, things like that. So it's very important that these level A criteria are met. Okay, the remarks and explanation section. So required. This is required for the remarks and explanation section, and then we have some best practices. So when a conformance level is partially supports or does not support, the remark should identify the functions or features with issues and how they do not fully support. So specifically where the issues are, and how they don't fully support. So if there is a navigation issue and there's a pop-up window that isn't being focused on, for example, they would say, partially supports change of context, but there is a pop-up issue that we're aware of and we're trying to fix. So if the criteria does not apply, explain why. So a lot of the time it will apply, but if it doesn't apply, then there has to be proper explanation as to why it doesn't apply. If an accessible alternative is used, describe it. So if there's a workaround, like Stephen was saying, then describe the workaround in the VPAT itself. Best practices for the remarks and explanation section. Some additional things to include. Information regarding the testing of a given criteria. So how we tested this, if it's a specific use case that's getting this error, then include that in the remarks and explanations. Just because it's a one cell table doesn't mean there's any limit as to how much data can go in that cell. I've seen VPATs that are very long. And don't be scared of those VPATs. A lot of the time, if it is well written, then it will be a longer document because there is sufficient explanations as to why things are supported or not supported. Information on application dependencies to support accessibility. I think we've already talked about this. So the operating system, the different app frameworks. So if it's an iOS app or an Android app, or if it's an issue only happening in the iOS app or Android app, things like that. Browsers recommended. So if it's recommended that this, if it's a browser-based system, it's recommended that Chrome is used, or it's recommended that Firefox is used to either not recreate this error or to recreate this error. And we want to let you know that Firefox, okay, maybe you want to stay away from Firefox if you're trying to use our system. How the customer can find more information about accessibility issues, bug ID. So if there is some sort of ID error code, if you get an error code a lot of the time in a piece of software, then you will get some sort of ID number associated with that. That's just a way for developers to identify bugs. So it is good to have, if there is a bug or something, it is good to have that code in the remarks and explanations as just as a best practice. And like I said, known workarounds for accessibility issues. Okay, looking at a good example of a VPAT, a well-written example of a VPAT. So here we have, again, criteria, conformance level, remarks and explanations. So again, we have conformance level not applicable. In this example, there is sufficient explanation as to why the criteria is not applicable to the software. So for criteria 1.2.1, audio and video only, pre-recorded media, I won't read the whole thing. It's not applicable. The site does not contain pre-recorded audio only or video only media. The next one's captions pre-recorded. The site does not contain pre-recorded synchronized media. So it provides good explanation as to why this criteria isn't applicable. Okay, another good example, continued. Even if the criteria is supports, there is sufficient explanation as to why it's supported. So for example, 3.2.1 on focus, when this is the criteria, this is level A. When any user interface component receives focus, it does not indicate a change of context. So this supports. There is, and then in the remarks and explanation section, there is no context change within the Sprout social app. That's the example I used. Pages when a component or control receives focus. So it's just explaining why this criteria is supported in their app or site. So you don't want copy and paste. You want, you know, usually you can tell if a person wrote, you know, this part. You usually want a unique explanation and remark for each section of the VPAT. Of course, if it's not applicable, then they might copy and paste a lot of things, and that's fine. But you don't want a ton of copying and pasting. Okay, so good example continued. The conformance level is partially supports. There's explanation as to why it only supports part of the criteria. So I won't go, this is 1.1.1, the very first criteria WCAG, non-text content. All non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose, except for the situations listed, and I won't get into it. So conformance level partially supports. For remarks and explanations, the site provides sufficient text alternatives for most instances of non-text content. Exceptions include, so it's listing the exceptions. The pencil icon, you know, the image tag for the picture of each dish. I won't go through everything, the alt attribute. So it gives sufficient explanation as to why it's only partially supported. This is a great sign and a green flag.
Red flags to look out for when going through a VPAT. Is the VPAT itself inaccessible? If it can't be read with a screen reader and keyboard, you know, if it's a untagged or even a scanned PDF, that's a big concern. Where is the VPAT published? Is it on the website readily available, or do you have to request it? If they use incorrect terminology, you know, passes and fails, don't know, things like that. If the vendor doesn't know what an ACR or VPAT is or won't complete one. If every criteria is marked as supported, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. Can be a major concern there if it's everything's supported and there's no explanation. If many criteria are not marked not applicable, a lot of level A criteria will be applicable no matter what product it is, so that can be another concern. If the VPAT is more than 1 year old. So products are constantly updated, new features are added, bugs are fixed. And so a VPAT from 2 or 3 years ago might not be very relevant to the current state of the product. And if the company wants an NDA signed before showing you the VPAT, chances are if they have something like that, they may have, you know, may not want to reveal the accessibility state of their product for some reason, or you may have something to hide in that circumstance. All right, green flags to look for. If they have an accessibility statement right on their website, that's easy to find. Good explanations for not supported or not applicable criteria, as things have been discussed previously. If the company is responsive to questions asked about accessibility or the VPAT, do they have plans and timelines in place to fix criteria that aren't supported or partially supported? And do they fix accessibility issues in a timely manner? Finally, the newer the VPAT, the better, as I discussed on the last slide. Things change, keeping the VPAT updated is promising, and also using newer versions of WCAG, such as 2.2. All right, how do I discuss VPATs with vendors? In a perfect world, they'll be upfront and discuss it right away with you and make it clear, but that's not always the case. You can use some questions to start out. Is your product accessible? Can I please read your VPAT? How current is the VPAT? If there's not a date at the top, there should be. What version of the VPAT template does your company use? Again, 2.5 is the most current. If there's a criteria that's not supported or not applicable that you think seems off, ask them why that is. Ask them how their company maintains accessibility with the products. Whether their VPAT is publicly available. If there does not support criteria, is there a timeline to fix them? If not, why not? What's the accessibility testing process? Do they use automated or manual testing? And do you involve blind users in your development process? That's an important one too, because there are many levels of comfort among blind users with technology, and involving blind people in the process will make sure the product is very usable, even beyond just the strict technical statements of the accessibility guidelines. All right, so if the VPAT looks good, now what? So the law does require vendors to have a VPAT, and an accessibility statement is not one. You can be skeptical about a VPAT, and should be, and ask them to prove it and demonstrate things. If there's criteria that are important that aren't supported, come to agreement on when that will be fixed. Give them milestones that they need to hit in order to move forward with contracting with you to use their products. Make sure they have accessibility maintenance plans in place. As the product gets updated, accessibility needs to be checked at every stage. All right, test and confirm. So if the VPAT seems valid and the website or software looks accessible from the VPAT, now you need to use testing tools and methodologies to confirm it yourself. Automated testing is useful for catching objective issues such as, does the page have headings? Are the form fields labeled? Do the graphics have alt text? It will scan an entire page or a site for issues. There are free and paid tools. A couple free ones are a Wave from a company called WebAIM, Axe from DQ, Arc Toolkit from TPGI. And so there's also manual testing, and some of the differences. Manual testing can catch judgment calls, automated testing can't. So for example, if your automated can test, is there alt text there? Manual can say, does it make sense? Manual can test more complex interactions, dealing with complex menus and other controls, and how those are, how efficient are they for a blind or screen reader user. It better simulates the user experience than an automated test. Automated testing is good for objective issues, as we discussed. Can determine something is there or not, but can't make judgment calls. It can detect around 30% of issues that are maybe on a given site. And finally, manual testing. As I said, can evaluate subjective aspects. Is the heading structure logical? So a computer can see that there's headings there, that they're numbered, but a manual tester can tell whether or not the headings are in a logical order or used on things that should be headings, things like that. Does the alternate text on a graphic make sense? As I mentioned earlier, is it just something generic, or does it actually have relevance to the context of and what the image shows. Do the form labels convey what the form is looking for? Say if you need a certain format on a number or date field. Is there a visual focus indicator? So if you go on a website and tab through, you'll be able to see a visual indicator around whatever item has focus. Some sites may have ones that don't have as good contrast or don't have them at all. Use browser zoom to make sure things scale properly. And also you can use a contrast checker to make sure things have the needed contrast, and the contrast checkers will show if it meets AA criteria. You can use a screen reader like Narrator or NVDA to move through the page with a keyboard and listen to how things read. NVDA is a free download that you can check out, and it is important to, whichever screen reader you use, take your time to get familiar with at least the basic keyboard controls. Screen readers have many dozens of keyboard shortcuts that let you do all sorts of things on a computer. I would strongly recommend you just take at least some time to familiarize yourselves with the ones for navigating the web, because they have ways to jump between headings and graphics and things like that, and otherwise navigate around a site. All right, Kennedy.
Okay, so we do have some resources for you guys, and when I send out, please email me. Again, my email has been put in chat a couple times, kzimnick@nfb.org. I can send you this PowerPoint. We have accessibility statements and some example VPATs as well. And then we also have VPATs available upon request. So sometimes the VPAT will just be posted on a website. That's really nice. That doesn't happen all the time. A lot of the time you're going to have to request the VPAT, and that's okay. A lot of the time it's just a web form that you request. Sometimes it'll have an email that you'll reach out to get the VPAT. But like we said on the slide, questions you can start asking. How do I discuss VPATs with vendors? We do want to stress that accessibility is it is a conversation, and it is an ongoing thing. It's not just a one-time, this is accessible and now it's accessible forever. It is an ongoing conversation between you and the vendors, especially if there are issues. Hopefully after today, you'll be able to catch some red flags to look for, things aren't applicable. It says supports just over and over again with no explanation as to why it supports. This is an ongoing conversation, and you shouldn't be nervous or scared to ask the tough questions. They are, if they want you to use their software, and if they want, the education agency to purchase and use their software, then they have to follow these guidelines laid out in WCAG, because that's what 7-910 requires.
National Federation of the Blind. Live the life you want.